Communications Manager. At this media conference, we will be providing an opportunity for members of the public to hear directly from the Attorney General regarding matters of public interest. I would like to hand over now to the Honourable Faris Al-Rawi, the Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Nasir. Good afternoon to you, ladies and gentlemen of the viewing public, to all the good citizens and people of Trinidad and Tobago. I greet you in the best way possible in this Yuletide season. I've come today to address a number of issues that are resonating in the public domain, and specifically to speak to the issue of the government's policy in relation to vaccinations in the public sector. I've taken very careful note of many observations and statements coming in large part from members of the trade union movement, as well as members of the protection agencies. In this regard, I think it important not only to address some of the observations made so far, but also to speak to the process of the way ahead in relation to managing this issue. I'd like to inform that the priority of any government is to speak to and provide for the best interests, the well-being of its citizens. As we are all very well aware, having lived for the last 2 years in Trinidad and Tobago under a COVID-19 pandemic, this is a serious position where thousands of persons have lost their lives. In this regard, there are many children who have been orphaned, many wives who have been widowed, many husbands who have lost their families. There has been a significant impact upon our economy. Every week, several times a week, we hear from the health professionals. We also hear, almost on a bi-weekly basis, from the Honourable Prime Minister as the head of the Cabinet on the situation in Trinidad and Tobago. The data which has been gathered and which has been shared with the population in its chapter and verse demonstrates that we are currently in a pandemic of the unvaccinated. There has been, of course, the emergence of the Omicron virus version of the COVID-19 virus, which is demonstrating an ability to double itself every 2.5 days. According to the Chief Medical Officer, this has also been made even more important on the basis that whilst at first there was some degree of information that the virus, the Omicron version of the COVID-19 virus, was less dangerous, that appears to not be the case. In this regard, with the further data coming forward that we have in fact received the Omicron virus in Trinidad and Tobago, and from people now, at least one person who has not had history of travel, the government was compelled to continue to consider balancing lives against livelihoods. We do know that the Honourable Prime Minister, quite simply, has reopened in progressive ways, in a step-by-step basis, the economy. This is so because, quite simply, we have to afford to live. In this regard, and in balancing the data against the positions that we're now looking at, the Honourable Prime Minister on Saturday gone indicated to the population that the government had taken the decision to introduce into the public sector, that is, all ministries, all state enterprises, all public bodies, including regional health authorities, including statutory entities such as the THA, for example, the Trinidad and Tobago Housing Development Corporation, CPEP, URP, all of these bodies, the government had taken the policy decision to require the presentation of a vaccine certificate. Secondly, in default of a vaccine certificate, a vaccine deferral or a vaccine exemption certificate, and that there would be a period of regular testing. The Honourable Prime Minister specifically indicated that the government would take the step to pass this matter across to me as Attorney General, because the obligation to draft the law in its final form and condition is the task of the Office of the Attorney General. It's in this regard that I'm compelled, bearing in mind the observations that I've seen, the observations I've made in the public domain, coming from the protective services, coming from the trade union, coming from the leader of the opposition who has condemned the Honourable Prime Minister's announcement, I think it important to indicate the process on the way ahead. Now, quite simply, the Honourable Prime Minister indicated that in January, by mid-January, the process of getting to perfecting the announced policy will be at hand. To get there, the policy having been indicated, I am currently settling draft alternatives of the law. We do know that the particulars of the law are really what are going to guide us. In this regard, as is the normal process, as Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs, I'm very pleased to inform that I wrote yesterday to a number of entities requesting a meeting with them, an immediate meeting with them, making myself available on quite simply any day. I am pleased to indicate that I've received at least 2 responses thus far. And for the record, I'd like to indicate that I wrote to those persons who comprise the protective services, that is Mr. Seron Richards, President of the Prisons Officers Association of Trinidad and Tobago, Inspector Gideon Dixon, President of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Social and Welfare Association, Mr. Leo Ramkisoon, President of the Fire Services Association of Trinidad and Tobago. By way of separate correspondence, I'm also pleased to inform that I wrote to the following people: Mr. Watson Duke, President of the Public Services Association, Mr. James Lambert, President of the National Union of Government and Federated Workers, Mr. David Abdullah, President of the Federation of Independent Trade Unions, again Mr. James Lambert, but in a different capacity, this time as President of the National Trade Union Centre. I also wrote to Mr. Michael Anisette, President General of the Seamen and Waterfront Workers Trade Union. I wrote to Ms. Joanne Ogier, President, Communications Workers Union. Mrs. Antonia De Freitas, President of the Trinidad and Tobago Unified Teachers Association. I also wrote to Mr. Edie Stewart, President of the Trinidad and Tobago Registered Nurses Association. I've written as well to Mr. Ansel Roger, President General of the Oilfield Workers Trade Union, and also to Mr. Mario Alves, President of the Banking, Insurance and General Workers Union. I wrote to all of these persons indicating that as Attorney General, the task being mine to draft and settle the law in relation to announced policy, that we were willing to receive, by way of consultation, recommendations and considerations coming from these several persons. I certified that I would make myself available beginning today. I'm pleased to inform that I received correspondence coming from the Oilfield Workers Trade Union. I received a response from Mr. Ozzie Warwick, specifically indicating that he undertook, both on behalf of himself and for several other unions, to indicate that they are in receipt of our correspondence and that they've been in contact with other unions and are currently discussing my invitation and will respond to me by this evening. I've also received correspondence coming from the Trinidad and Tobago Registered Nurses Association, and they in fact indicated that they'd be pleased to meet either Tuesday 21st December or Wednesday 22nd for the meeting as proposed by me. I welcome this opportunity to engage in this dialogue process, this consultation where the government listens to the recommendations that should come from the respective entities that I have quoted. In respect of the process as it works itself down to law, permit me now to explain this process. In any conversation, it's important that there is a starting point. And the starting point for the government was the indication of its policy. And that policy is that vaccinations should be in the public service for the employees and employers in the public service. So that there is no lack of clarity, the public service in this regard, the public sector as a preferable expression, includes any aspect of government, whether it is a company owned by the government, if it is a statutory authority, if it is a ministry. All of these entities are considered as part of the public sector. The reason that we have taken this, as the Honourable Prime Minister indicated, is because the government constitutes the largest employer in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. And as we have seen from weekly and daily conferences at times coming from the Ministry of Health, we have hit a vaccination wall. The vaccination wall has resulted in very few people accepting vaccines. We know that 9 out of 10 patients are in the hospital, high dependency, and also in the intensive care units. 9 out of 10 of those persons who are at the cusp of death and jeopardy are unvaccinated. We have received umpteen cases that now stand where persons who could otherwise have been the beneficiaries of receiving medical attention, in fact succumb to COVID-19 in circumstances where, if there was room, they could perhaps have received the attention that could have saved their lives. As Attorney General, I have taken the care to speak with all of my colleagues in the CARICOM context, Attorneys General in Jamaica, in Turks and Caicos, in Barbados, in several other jurisdictions. We have all shared our respective perspectives, and I have taken time to consider judgments of many courts around the world, as well as the laws that have been crafted. Now, it's no secret, in the wider world, right now, states of emergency have been declared. Washington, for instance, as a part of the United States, a state of emergency has been declared. Right throughout Europe, restrictions are being applied. And in many jurisdictions, the concept of vaccinations in sectors have been taken. It is very interesting to observe that in the jurisprudence that comes out of the courts, many courts have taken the opportunity to convincingly set out the position that the election of a vaccination program, such as the type that the government has indicated its policy on, is one that is certainly deserving of support. Injunctions have been refused around the world, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in the European context, in Southeast Asia, in Australia, in New Zealand. And very importantly, I wish to put on the record here something that will assist people. The concept of collective bargaining, which is an aspect of industrial relations and a very valuable one, is separate and apart from the law of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. The law of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago is what we are discussing, and everything falls under the law. This does not mean that there will not be genuine dispute in the courts of Trinidad and Tobago. After all, this issue which we are discussing is quite properly a constitutional issue. On the one hand, we are dealing with the rights and privileges, the right to life in the Constitution. On the other hand, we're dealing with aspects of choice, also mixed into several of those rights set out in Section 4 and in reflection in Section 5 of the Constitution. But with the data as it is, not only in Trinidad and Tobago but around the world, what we are treating with is where that balance lies. Now, it's very interesting to note that in the Commonwealth context, that is in the United Kingdom, in Canada, in New Zealand, in Australia, in many of the jurisdictions that accept the English law as part and parcel of its equation, that the rights and individual concepts have been balanced against preserving lives in a larger context, such that injunctions have been refused and laws, including mandatory vaccine laws, have been upheld. Permit me to say, as Minister Diyal Singh has very clearly and commendably said, the government is not proposing a mandatory vaccination law. The government is proposing that persons who are in the public sector, who are going to work in the public sector, that they will have the choice of being vaccinated and turning up to work, or if they choose to not receive a vaccine, for instance for medical reasons, medical exemption or medical deferral, that they would have to be tested on a standing basis or elect not to continue in employment. It's in this particular aspect that the conversation with the many persons that I have identified today becomes very relevant. Of course, as Attorney General, I'm obliged to consider matters that are raised in consultation and then to advise the Cabinet on the final prescriptions of the law. But I wish us to please not run too far ahead. I do think it a very appropriate time of the year and a very appropriate circumstance that we're in, that we take this matter with measure. It's important that rather than agitate as the leader of the opposition has against certain issues, that we do take the opportunity to consider these issues. In most of the jurisdictions that I've looked at, most of the countries, laws have been passed already, or certain entities have elected to introduce measures such as this without a law. In Trinidad and Tobago, the context had to be gelled by a policy decision of the government. The room for exploring this position is now at hand, and in a consultation process, as the representative of the government, I will certainly be entertaining and listening to the matters raised. We're talking about a very serious situation. If our hospitals are overrun, no amount of medical expansion is going to treat with a virus that can double itself every 2.5 days. When we look at what has happened with young children succumbing to this, with entire families being affected, with businesses being habitually closed, we're talking the livelihood and health and wealth and benefit of the entire nation. I'd like to inform, before we go to question time, that in Trinidad and Tobago, I'm able to now report that, quite interestingly related perhaps to this topic, we did have the matter of the Tobago House of Assembly, the interpretation matter which I took to court, that was brought before the court yesterday. The emergency judge in that matter, Madam Justice Donaldson Honeywell, gave directions in the matter, and the judge before whom the matter is docketed, that is Madam Justice Margaret Mohammed, will be hearing that matter in January. We have directions of the court now before us, where affidavits of the Recognition Board are to be filed by the 28th of December 2021. Affidavits of the defendants, that is the THA, Mr. Watson Duke and Mr. Farley Augustine, they are to be filed on the 5th of January 2022. Affidavits of the Attorney General are to be filed on January 10th, 2022. Quite interestingly, attorneys appearing for Mr. Watson Duke in the person of Mr. Anand Ramlogan of Senior Counsel, in assisting him, Mr. Kent Samlal and Mr. Javid Jagru, all instructed by Mr. Vishal Siu Saran. They represent Mr. Watson Duke. Obviously, Mr. Ramlogan and the particular attorneys here are well known to us. They are, first of all based in Trinidad and Tobago, and secondly, habitually before the court on behalf of the opposition, the United National Congress. Appearing for Mr. Farley Augustine yesterday, we noted the appearance of Mr. Kyle Taklal Singh, again, a well-known Southern lawyer from south of Trinidad, who is no stranger to us, having represented many matters brought by the opposition to the courts. I'd just like to say that in this particular matter, you will note that I wrote to Mr. Watson Duke as the president of the Public Services Association in relation to the vaccine matter. Again, I'm cautioning that it is a rather uncomfortable situation that Mr. Watson Duke sits as the Deputy Chief Secretary, and that therefore, immediately, that is right now, that is today, I'm writing to a president of the Public Services Association who must answer or consider answering the invitation made by the government. But quite interestingly, I'm also treating with the same individual who wears the hat of having to implement a government policy with respect to vaccines in the context of the Tobago House of Assembly, because the Tobago House of Assembly is a statutory authority. So I would just like to urge the understanding of all persons in our society that there comes a time when we have to respectfully consider what is in the best interest of the nation. Doors are not closed. The opportunity to have constructive consultation is before us. Any law that the government tables into the Parliament will be brought in the month of January, and therefore there is ample time for us to treat with concerns, legitimate concerns. And I'd like to say to all persons that I've written to, the government respects the views and considerations of all persons in society, but the government must act because it has the mandate to act. In this regard, receiving information in a consultative process will better our positions, but bear in mind that we do not have the luxury of time, particularly with an Omicron variant that multiplies and duplicates itself 2 times over every 2 days. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the springboard into question time, where I look forward to having the opportunity to provide clarification to the very many questions. We elected to have this press conference today because I'd been receiving a number of messages from multiple persons in public life, multiple persons in the media corps, and therefore it was just simply more productive to have a discussion all together in front of the nation, where perhaps people can move away with a bit more information and a better understanding. So may I make myself open to your questions, please, as we are moderated by Nazir Mohammed.
Thank you, AG. We now move into our question and answer segment. Media representatives, you are kindly asked to state your name and your media house before putting questions to the AG. Responses will be given to 2 questions per media house in this first instance, and if time permits, we will accommodate additional questions. First up, we have Priya Bihari, AZP News.
Hi, good afternoon. Priya Bihari, azpnews.com. IEG, I wanted to find out when this matter goes to become law, we would need, I think you have said that we wouldn't need a special majority. So I'm asking, how come, because to me, I think, this is a matter of choice, and a public servant would have a choice, and if he doesn't take the vaccine, that means he wouldn't be able to work and get a salary. So how is this not an infringement of the right of an individual? And my second question is, how long do you think it will take for you to bring all of these laws to Parliament? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question, Priya. In my introduction before question time, I did clearly say that we are treating with a balancing of rights. The balancing of rights between those persons who wish to be protected in the context of being vaccinated and those persons who wish to exercise their free choice in not being vaccinated. Fortunately for us, many courts in the Commonwealth have already dealt with this issue, and the lines are very clearly established. So we're not reinventing the wheel. In this particular instance, the question is, what is the appropriate remedy? The reason why I drew this distinction between what the government is proposing and a mandatory vaccine, perhaps I should explain that. A mandatory vaccination law is where you say to persons in Trinidad and Tobago, as I could easily propose to the government, if a mandatory law was being dealt with, we could simply say in the public health ordinance that all persons are to be vaccinated unless there were certain circumstances. For instance, you medically couldn't have it, etc. That's not something that doesn't exist in the laws of Trinidad and Tobago. If we look to the primary and if we look to the nurseries and primary schools vaccination laws, you will see a closer example of what a mandatory vaccination law looks like. Mumps, rubella, measles, smallpox, etc. In this case here, and quite interestingly, just today making the rounds, of course, is a judgment out of the Ontario courts. You will note that because you have a choice between accepting the recommendation in the policy of being vaccinated, your choice is that you can receive the vaccine or not receive the vaccine. If you don't receive the vaccine and you have the medical or deferral certificates and you present yourself with PCR testing every 2 weeks, as in the Canada case in the Mount Sinai Hospital, and the transportation case in Canada was just done by the Supreme Court, you will see that that court has already reflected that that does not resemble a mandatory vaccination requirement when you drill deep into it. Now, if we just talk plain, most people will say, well, you're giving me no choice, because the choice is give up my employment and looking after my family as a right that some people say that they have and that others can convincingly argue. But the courts have already determined a lot of these issues, and they've not determined it in that way. Obviously, this is where the unions and the many people come in, because how we tailor make the exemptions are critically important. What's the process in the transitional provisions? When are you vaccinated? Is it on your first dose of a 2-dose regime? Is it a number of weeks? Do you commence the program? There are nuances which are very important to understanding how some things may be viewed as acceptable versus not acceptable. And that's where the consultation dynamic becomes important. What we have done is to state what our policy is. Now, to answer your second question, how soon do we have the ability to get to Parliament? I can say that we have an ability to move as quickly as we can. Drafting this law, I have multiple versions of the law already drafted, but those versions are going to be further tailored based upon the submissions that we receive and may consider in consultation. So we are able to move immediately. The Honourable Prime Minister gave the opportunity, firstly, for people to consider where we stand by announcing that in mid-January we would get to this equation. Right now it's time to receive comments. Now some people may be saying, look, this appears to be rather quick. They want some time. Unfortunately, the Omicron version of the virus, the Delta version of the virus, and the number of people that are being killed as a result of the disease does not await the outcome or luxury of time. COVID is not going to receive a recommendation that it goes on holiday whilst we continue to live in Trinidad and Tobago. Lastly, even though you asked two questions, your first part of your question was bifurcated. As to simple majority versus special majority, we are absolutely clear in our minds that not every Section 4 or Section 5 right requires a special majority. And in these circumstances, my own advice to the Cabinet, as has been underwritten and supported by several respected senior counsel in and out of Trinidad and Tobago, all agree that this is a simple majority law.
Thank you, AG. We move on to Jewel Brown, TV6.
Good afternoon, Attorney General. So one of the things that you had mentioned in terms of the issue of consultation, that the government is open to it and so on. I'm wondering, was there any sort of consultation process before you presented your recommendation to the Cabinet? That's one. And also as well, in terms of, as you had just identified, that persons would say there's the interpretation from the government, it's not a mandate, it's a choice. Others are saying it's essentially a mandate because you really don't have much of a choice if you want to receive your salary in the public sector. But just to be clear, this is a furlough situation and not persons, because you had mentioned something about persons who want to continue employment. But I recall on Saturday that the announcement was a furlough situation, as in you would stay on the job but not be paid. So just some clarity in that on those two things.
Sure. Thank you very much. So to confirm, yes, there was consultation prior to the Honourable Prime Minister's announcement of this policy, but there was much more than consultation. There was data that was pulled, data which was applied in the context of where we stand. And in looking at this, in having the consultation that we did, we also consulted with the medical experts, both here and elsewhere, as to where we stand. Significant factor was given to the WHO's position on this matter, and indeed the Commonwealth and European Court of Human Rights judgments. Those were seriously considered. What's required is to form an opinion and state a policy. And that's what we did. That's what the Honourable Prime Minister announced on Saturday. With the baton handed over to the Office of the Attorney General, now we get down to the details. And in answering the second part of your question with respect to furlough, etc., the concept is that if you are without a medical exemption certificate, without a medical deferral certificate, in the circumstance where you are not vaccinated, then you will be considered to be absent without leave. And of course, there's a division between the public service regulations, Regulation 49, and of course, the other aspects of without leave, because you have people on contract, you have people who may not be in the same boat, so you can't use just the public service regulations. After you're considered to be absent without leave, then there is the natural progression of how long you can be absent without leave. And then there is the statement which has to be pinpointed right now as to when that absence of leave will end. So the absence without leave, the furloughing, the fact that you're employed and therefore still employed but not receiving salary, there is an end to that road in law, because you can't be furloughed indefinitely. Furloughing comes to an end and gets down to the form of abandonment or dismissal. So there are consequences to indefinite furlough. And obviously, this is where hearing from the entire trade union movement, as I have written to the vast majority of persons, becomes very relevant. I want to remind that we are not treating with, as some people are casting it, with collective agreements. We are treating with constitutional issues and the law, because any collective agreement can, in a very clear version of the law, be subjugated to the law. In other words, then a collective agreement is a voluntary process, a defined process ending in a result, which is then registered at the industrial court as to how you will meet and treat with certain issues between a recognized majority trade union and an employer. That is not the law. The law of the land is very different. And what we are talking about here is a law to regulate this process, which is why I said earlier that one can easily expect that this may end up in the courts, that is the High Court, Court of Appeal, Privy Council, in relation to the constitutional issues that spring from this discussion.
We move on next to Rayrikomas from 103 FM.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to Joel for taking my questions, but I will piggyback off of what he was saying anyway. In terms of the discussions that would have taken place prior to the announcement by the Prime Minister, could you indicate, AG, who those discussions were with, if it included the unions and so on? And secondly, my other question is there any way in this discussion, if the consensus is from the upcoming consultations that persons don't want this particular policy to go forward, what is the potential for it to be shelved, if at all? Thank you.
So let me explain what consultation is in law. And let me explain why we took the process that we did. So we did consult very broadly with a number of entities, too many to name right now. we did not collectively speak or speak collectively to the trade union movement. Even though I would have had personal interactions in public forum with union representatives, for instance, in a shared program with Mr. David Abdullah, where we discussed, it was hosted by Kamal Georges, where we discussed the actual issue in a very square way. Even though we have had those sorts of discussions, we have not spoken in a collective way with the trade unions. What's the reason? People need to know where you are. The government received its information, assessed its data, consulted with experts, looked at the international context, consulted again, and then the government announced its policy. The starting point for any proper conversation is, what is your policy on this? Are you for or against? Consultation means that you listen and you consider. Consultation does not require agreement. One would be ill-advised to approach consultation with the point that it's a foregone conclusion that it's going to happen. The obligation in consultation is to give it your best shot at listening and finding a path where there may be agreement. What the government has determined, and its position as announced by the Honourable Prime Minister, is that this policy will go into effect in mid-January. The particulars of how the policy is implemented find itself in the words of the bill, the law which will amend the Public Health Ordinance or other pieces of law that we're looking at. And therefore, the granular approach is imperative. Obviously, as Attorney General, I will be listening and then considering and then seeking further instructions. But as it stands, there is no shelving on the table because we are certainly not in that position where we are with thousands of deaths and where there is a clear position announced by the Prime Minister.
We move on now to Kijan Haynes from News at 7.
Hi, good afternoon. My question is kind of a piggyback on this. This public service announcement, does this apply to the Parliament as well? So is it possible that we can see MPs or senators on both sides of the aisle being furloughed if they do not show their vaccination status? And are there any members of the public service who may be exempt from this simply because they are too important to the running of the nation? For example, if you furlough 50% of the TTPS that's unvaccinated right now, I see like that could be a problem. So are there any members of the public service who could possibly be exempt from this rule? And the first question was, does this apply to Parliament? Can we see MPs or senators being furloughed as well?
There certainly is the intention. If you look to the definition of a public body in the Public Procurement and Disposal of Property Act, public body provides itself with a very good description of what the categories to be caught look like. So that's certainly under consideration. The Parliament is a unique place. The entire government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, every single senator and every single member of Parliament in the House have publicly declared that we are all vaccinated. Where we don't have parity is with the opposition. And therefore the Parliament, quite interestingly, does not stand as a safe zone. We're required to not do as people do in a restaurant, not do as people do in a theatre, not do as they do in a bar. It's odd that Mrs. Prasad Bisesa would take the view of not allowing the Parliament to be a safe zone. The Parliament has certain privileges which are unique, and therefore the particulars of the law as it relates to the Parliament will be a factor that we will work out in the final detail, but it is certainly the intention that this law applies to the Parliament. You will note that we made history last week where Mr. Brian Manning, who was in COVID quarantine, participated in the Parliament by virtue of a virtual participation. But the law cannot be discriminatory. People in similar circumstances must be treated similarly. That's an aspect of our Constitution. So the Parliament is not intended to be an exception to this rule. If there is a challenge in relation to that, part of it is dealt with in the Parliament, and part of it may be dealt with in the courts if the Parliament don't deal with it. Your second question, treated with certain further aspects. Would you mind just refining your second question for me, please? It was a little bit broad. I'd be grateful if you were to just hone it in for me, please.
Hello. Yes, I was asking if there are any sectors of the public service who may be deemed too essential that if there are over 50% of them to be furloughed because they're not vaccinated, that you may have to walk back your decision. In other words, if 50% of the TTPS still decides they are not going to be vaccinated, are they now be granted an exemption because of their importance to the running of the nation?
So the answer to that is no. There is no exception intended. That would be contrary to the international framework that exists. If you look to multiple countries, all of Europe, the United States of America, Southeast Asia, if you look to the world at large, you don't have that kind of approach. Other countries have taken this step way in advance to Trinidad and Tobago. And no, it is not intended that there will be any exception at this point. What is important is for us to consider the input in the consultative process. As I informed you, we wrote to the protective services, fire services, the Police Welfare Association and the prison services. My colleague, Minister Hines, is at this very moment involved in discussions with the heads of divisions, etc., and data, etc. But the virus makes no exception for the fact that you wear red or yellow or green and yellow. It makes no exception for the fact that you're a policeman or not. We heard the Police Welfare Association Inspector Dixon saying that 22 policemen had died and that the association was very upset by these things. So we have to be consistent in the approach. COVID-19 kills you if you are susceptible to the disease, and it does not matter where you come from. There's no get out of position there. What we do know, simple, basic, common sense facts. If 9 out of 10 people in an ICU bed are unvaccinated, your answer lies right there, literally.
We move on to Kimberly Ramkalawan of Multicultural TV.
Hi, good day, Attorney General. With regards to the aim of you all making the public service a safe zone, what does this mean to the public accessing services from the relevant agencies? Would this mean that a certain segment of the population be denied government services if they do not present a vaccination card? Also, my second part of the question is just how much of the public service is currently vaccinated? Thank you.
So let's deal with it in reverse order. The Honourable Prime Minister gave the data on Saturday. We're looking at 30% of the Defence Force, 40-odd% of the TTPS. I can tell you at the Ministry of the Attorney General, we're at 61%. Some of the RHAs, 75%, some are in their 40s. What we do know is that the energy sector, the manufacturing sector, etc., the banking sector, you look at Republic Bank, which is a private entity, they are at 92% vaccination. So the energy sector makes no bones about it. The energy sector quite simply said to people, if you're not vaccinated, you can't work here. And they are therefore up in the 90%. You made a very important question. You asked a very important question about persons accessing the public service. Patrons who access the public service, people who come for services at the public sector, are not in the bucket of being asked to receive or produce their vaccination certificates. The reason is that we can control the crowds. So we can't control the workforce in a productive environment. You require your employees. if the Attorney General's office does not have a registrar of deaths at work, and we lost one of our amazing registrars of deaths in Tobago, a young man to COVID. If we don't have a registrar of deaths, then you can't perform burials. If you don't have air traffic controllers, your airline industry and your airports are in jeopardy. So because we need employees to be productive, if you can't register deeds, mortgages, and conveyances at the Attorney General's office, you can't sell a property, a contractor can't be paid. There are lots of ripple effects. But because we can control the access to premises via online attendance, via appointment attendance, via spacing, etc., it's not at this stage on the table that the patrons or persons accessing services are to be vaccinated, similar to supermarkets, etc. What we are looking at, employees and employers, i.e. managers, etc., of the public sector, that is where we're looking to do the vaccinations.
We have a follow-up question from Prior now.
Yes, good afternoon again. Thank you, Nazir. AG, as we go forward with this, when the announcement was made on Saturday, there was the clip that was shown again of the president of the industrial court, Ms. Thomas Felix, saying that if you tell people that they must get vaccinated, that is changing the terms and condition of the employment of an employee. Is this an issue? How are you going to go forward with this? Because I think, do you need the unions to agree to do this? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question, Prior. You've raised actually a point that really does deserve some clarification. The president of the industrial court, in speaking out of the court, because it was not in the context of a matter that was the subject of a decision, volunteered a point of view which is that of the president. I was very careful to indicate that we are treating with the laws of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. We are not treating with the collective bargaining agreements. The collective bargaining agreements will be as they are. We are proposing a change to the law. Collective bargaining structures, as I said earlier, one of the views, the strong-held views, is that collective bargaining processes are outside of the parent law. So the collective bargaining agreement, for instance, falls second to mask wearing. There's a mask wearing law. Somebody can't say, well, my collective agreement didn't treat with mask wearing and therefore go inside of that. Because what we're treating with is a change to the laws of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. So there's a very important difference between the industrial court, its dynamic. I mean, obviously the president of the industrial court, having pronounced a public view on an aspect of work that can come before the president, probably cannot sit on any of these matters, because in essence she's put forward a view, quite respectfully, that shows that she has formed a view in anticipation of hearing an event. That's a very unusual situation. In other words, then, it would be open to any participant, any party before the industrial court to ask the Honourable President of the Industrial Court to recuse herself from hearing any matter on the ground of bias, whether it is actual or apparent, in having predetermined the issue in the manner of her speech being interpreted that way. In relation to challenge, it's not to say that this or any law that treats with this will not be subject to the sanitizing effect of being challenged. The forum for challenge will be the High Court, the Court of Appeal, and the Privy Council, because this certainly involves constitutional issues. And constitutional issues are addressed in the High Court. If a constitutional issue arose in the industrial court, you take that aspect to the High Court. So the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, that balancing of rights, my rights to say no to this, that is properly open to challenge, and indeed one can easily say will be challenged in the courts of law. What we do know is that multiple courts around the world, the European Court of Human Rights, the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom, the Supreme Court in Canada, etc., etc., Jamaica right next to us, have all been hearing these matters, and one by one, the courts around the globe have determined that the majority protection is important. Remember, if I put it this way, you have the right to swing your arm, but you don't have the right for your fist to connect with someone else. There are balances of rights there. So this is something that you've got to be very careful about. The government will, of course, welcome and be prepared in the event of disagreement for any challenge. But what is important right now is that I'm saying unequivocally and clearly that as the person with responsibility to settle the law, I have put forward a very open invitation with a very open mind in a consultative process to receive views so that the particulars of the law can be settled upon by the government after hearing certain views. Because it's at that point that one will have to live with the consequences. And obviously, the invitation for full and broad consultation had to follow a statement of policy. The following of the policy is the critical point. The Honourable Prime Minister announced the policy. The baton is passed to the Attorney General. The Attorney General now engages in a process, and we get on with the job, bearing in mind that Omicron COVID-19 is doubling from 10% to 20% in 2.5 days. From 20 to 40% in 2.5 days. And if you look to the data, the CMO presented some data to us. You're accustomed to the graphs that you see on television. And when you look at the graphs, you see a curve that goes up. The data coming out of the United Kingdom, according to the Chief Medical Officer, is not a curve going up. It's a perpendicular line. Omicron just becomes a block, a perpendicular line. And therefore, other countries have already implemented things like mass burial sites. And that's how severe other countries have become. What we have to do is to try and find the mechanism to ensure our continued preparedness. Our parallel healthcare system has worked extremely well. The public service break between December 24th, coming back to work on the 3rd of January, will help, God willing, to introduce some interruptions. You see in the United Kingdom and other places, they're announcing restrictions. Some people have curfews. If you go to the Netherlands, etc., places in Europe that thought that they had passed this, the key is for us as a country to remember that time is not on our side.
We move on to a follow-up from Joel.
Yes, good afternoon again. One of the things you said, Attorney General, in terms of the issue of that you expect it will be challenged in the court and so on. Could you just give some clarification or explanation for those who may not understand how this works? If, let's say, it goes to Parliament, it's challenged and whatnot, during any point of the challenge, let's say it goes to the appeal court or the Privy Council, can the law be implemented, or does it have to wait for that final ruling? So that's the first follow-up. And secondly, as well, if it is that, let's say, because you have the situation with the police service, as Kijan had pointed out earlier, and the number of officers who have not yet been vaccinated, if you find this going through, let's say, the police service, fire service, prison service, or certain key aspects of the public sector, and they don't subscribe to taking the vaccine, even with the law as you're presenting it, does the government have a backup plan to ensure those services are not compromised?
Your first question can be put very simply into the following, and please feel free to correct me if I've got it wrong. You're effectively asking, if this law is passed and there's a constitutional claim, can there be an injunction to stop it? That's ultimately what you asked. Whether it can be implemented. And fortunately, we're not reinventing the wheel. Many countries around the world have heard applications for injunctions in respect of laws just like the one that we're proposing and discussing right now. And I don't think that the vast majority of cases have gone any way other than saying that the injunction is not appropriate. Of course, I cannot presuppose what a fair and independent court in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago will do. But what I am comforted by, what people can be comforted by, is that nothing excludes the court, and that therefore your rights can be considered in any challenge to any law of Trinidad and Tobago and in Trinidad and Tobago. I would therefore leave it to the courts to determine whether something can be the subject of an injunction, a successful injunction. Secondly, in relation to the backup plan question, yes, there are always backup plans. But for me, and I say this quite personally, it's a very individual statement, I pray that the backup plan is simple common sense. I pray that the backup plan is to understand as a nation that we've had over 2,000 people die, that we have 1,000 infections a day. Just a day or two ago, 32 people died. We're dying by the 30s right now. And quite a horrible death. A death where you can't breathe. I don't know if you've ever contemplated that from a personal perspective, but that can be the most horrendous of deaths for some people. So the essential, again, this is a very personal Faris Al-Rawi statement here. Forgive me for calling my own name in a press conference, but I'm praying that common sense will result in this equation. And I'm praying that union leaders, agitators in society, including Mrs. Prasad Bisesa, who is dead set against this particular matter, I'm praying that they will understand that the opportunity for views to be put forward in a consultation aspect is a very golden one, and that they would find room to support measures to protect people's lives.
We have a follow-up question now from Kijan.
Thanks again. Mr. AG, you touched on it earlier. I understand that it's still early and subject to change, but as of now, in your mind, come mid-January, what is vaccinated? Should a public servant be fully vaccinated, at least 1 dose, 2 doses, and a booster, understanding that if somebody goes now, they may not even be fully vaccinated by January 15. So what is your version of vaccinated? And my second question is, given that there is now new leadership under the THA, does the THA have authority to overrule this decision?
Thank you so much. Those are very pertinent questions. With respect to vaccinations, so we're accustomed in the public of hearing of fully vaccinated means, with respect to a 2-dose vaccine regime, 2 shots and 2 weeks after the second shot, for a single dose 2 weeks after the single dose. And what I can tell you is that fortunately the Canadian laws provided an excellent precedent. The precedent is that you commence a vaccination regime. And therefore we are settling upon the commencement of the program. You've got 1 shot of a 2-shot regime, and you're on your way with an obligation to complete the second shot, etc. Boosters are not currently part of that arrangement. That is a moving target which can be adjusted by way of regulations which accompany the parent law that we're considering. You asked a question about the THA being under new leadership and whether they have any positions. The THA Act is absolutely clear as to the autonomy that is in the THA's hands. It's a semi-autonomous arrangement. The schedules to the THA Act identify the aspects that they have administrative control over. As you're well aware, the government fought tooth and nail to convert the THA to island-style government, where they would have had the power to consult in the law, where they would have had their own version of an attorney general, their own version of a cabinet, and where we would have repealed the THA as a statutory authority. What is a statutory authority? WASA, HDC. Those are statutory authorities. The THA is right there along them. It's a creature of statute. And they have very limited functions. So even though we fought tooth and nail to give the powers that you're reflecting upon right now, they don't exist. That does not mean that the government is not obliged to continue its working relationship with the THA. One must obviously respect the THA, and we do. And I am very hopeful that that will be a prosperous relationship, and I'll tell you why. There's very good evidence. You'll recall, and I say this now in a very light-hearted way, that Mr. Farley Augustine was very forthright in his statement to say he takes no advice from the Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago. But Mr. Augustine turned up in court via his attorneys. Mr. Duke turned up with his attorneys, and not one of his attorneys even vaguely has root in Tobago, and not one of them arguably even come from Port of Spain. They're all in San Fernando out of connection to Mr. Anand Ramlogan's chambers. So clearly there's been a quantum shift. The position taken by Mr. Farley Augustine is now supplanted by evidence, and the evidence is that he's taking advice rooted in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. So please accept that for all the lightheartedness in the world, and understand where I'm going. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm being cautioned that we've run out of time, and therefore in those circumstances, permit me to just wrap up at this point, and I will say in summary, number one, the Prime Minister has articulated a very clear and cogent and supportable position of vaccinations in the public sector. That's in the broadest sense. Secondly, the obligation to perfect the announced policy falls into the office of the Attorney General. And in that regard, I have written to many persons in the trade union sector. I've also written to the protective services. There are other invitations if people wish to have them entertained, asking for engagement in a consultative process, because it is in the detail of the prescription of law that we have opportunity perhaps to find common ground. All matters raised in consultation will be considered, and then the government will take the steps that it is advised to take, and that the Cabinet will ultimately settle upon. Any law that goes to the Parliament has to be approved by the Cabinet of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Omicron COVID-19 is doubling at a rate of 2.5 days. Every 2.5 days, you just double it. People are continuing to die. Orphans are amongst us. Widows and widowers are amongst us, and tragedy continues to grip the world. Therefore, time is critical. As Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs entrusted with the responsibility to deal with this issue, I have made myself available every single day to treat with this issue, and I look forward. I thank the OWTU and the TTRNA, and I'm sure others are coming in, for replying to the invitation thus far, and indicating, in the case of the OWTU, who's speaking with the other unions, that they will get back to us this evening, and the TTRNA, the registered nurses, have already accepted an invitation. So I'm quite confident that we as a people can find it within ourselves to look after each other. Permit me at this opportunity to say to the people of Trinidad and Tobago that we wish you an extremely safe and reflective Christmas period. I'd like to assure you, as a member of Parliament in the structures of government, as the Member of Parliament for San Fernando West, I personally arranged and attended to hundreds of homes at a time, thousands of persons in San Fernando West. In one case, having touched almost 2,000 people, door to door, having taken a caravan of doctors, having arranged vaccines, I got a whopping 7 people willing to take the vaccine. Most people on the ground aspect of MP engagement indicated to me that when the gears shifted, that they would consider their position, and I asked my beautiful brothers and sisters in San Fernando West to lead the way in Trinidad and Tobago by warmly embracing an opportunity for us to work together to get this right. So, Merry Christmas to you all. I assure you the government will continue to be working. I know it's not an easy situation. I know there may be many upset feelings amongst us, but I'm asking for the opportunity for us to work together. You certainly have my commitment to do my very best, and I do so on behalf of the team that is the government. God bless you all, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you for joining us at today's media conference. Please remember to wear your mask, wash your hands, and watch your distance. Take care, stay safe, and Merry Christmas.
Introducing NLCB's multiplier trio of games. That's 3 games that can multiply your winnings by 10, 20, or 50 times. The multiplier X effect gives you the chance to win up to 800